Well, welcome everyone to a talk with the theme of voyages to the Southern Ocean. I think it was reading Lucas Bridges' book that made me think about it, but of course I've been talking about a few voyages to the Southern Ocean in previous talks as well, and it seemed appropriate. It seemed an interesting focus. And don't be alarmed, I'm not going to talk about all those voyages that I've listed on the left-hand side of this page, but I thought I would just pick out one or two that are interesting or did something different. And also, so that's those in bold on the screen in front of you. Just to realize that Columbus, on his third voyage, landed in South America, actually in the coast of Venezuela, in 1498. And everything happened pretty quickly after that. So Amerigo Vespucci, who I'm not going to talk about, but did give his name to the Americas, was only 3 years later. He landed on the coast of Brazil. And as you can see, Magellan was shortly thereafter doing things. And I thought just quickly, before I move on, let's just quickly recap on the geography. So the larger picture, which I hope you can see on the right, is Tierra del Fuego, a bit zoomed in, where you can see that, as we know today, it is an island, and the strait, Magellan Strait, runs through and joins what we now call the Atlantic to the Pacific. In quite complicated ways, but there's also the Beagle Channel that runs further south, east to west, and the other little gap that will come up during later on is the Le Maire Strait, which separates the toe, if you like, of Tierra del Fuego from the island to the east, Staten Island. So I just thought I'd show you that to get your bearings. Now, Magellan. Charles V of Spain gave Magellan command of a fleet of 5 ships, and they wanted to find a westward route via southern South America to the Spice Islands. And there on that map in the middle, you can see the route he took, right down, hugging the coast of South America with his little fleet. And in 1520, they overwintered at Puerto San Julian, Port St. Julian, just north of the mouth of the strait he was to discover, which was a pretty bleak place. And in fact, he had a mutiny there and had to hang a few of his crew members. They then continued south and went through the strait, the gap he found, which then was given his name afterwards, of course, and emerged into the Pacific. Now, Magellan himself didn't have that much more to do with Latin America. He crossed the Pacific Ocean and reached, or you could say discovered for Europeans, the Philippines, and there he was killed. So that was the end of his story. But the Victoria, his ship, made it all the way around the world. And there's a rather nice replica of it in Punta Arenas, which is the picture on the left there in the Now Museum, which is worth seeing when you're there. And I also put in a picture of Magellan penguins, Magellanic penguins for you. The other important aftermath of Magellan's trip was that the Spanish established a trade crossing route across the Pacific, both ways. They worked out how to go, depending on the winds, either just north or just south of the equator. The South Sea, as the Southern Pacific was called, was pretty unknown at this stage, and really all it did was gather stories and myths. Now, Francis Drake is our next voyage. The English were pretty jealous of the Spanish success with their empire in the Americas and beyond. And as we all know, privateers, there was a fine line between whether you were a pirate or whatever. Anyway, Queen Elizabeth sent Francis Drake on a privateering expedition. One objective was to see if the coast of Patagonia was fit for settlement, but the other, I think, was just to hassle the Spanish as much as he could. So he sailed with 5 ships. His flagship was called the Pelican, and he had 164 men. They managed to capture a 6th ship off Portugal somewhere called the Santa Maria, and luckily her captain had some experience in South American waters. However, he did lose 2 ships on the crossing of the Atlantic, which gives you an idea of the perils. They too spent winter in Puerto San Julian. They saw the gallows that Magellan had used some years before. And in fact, Drake himself had to execute his second in command for insubordination at the same spot. So there you are. Sadly for him, the knowledge of his Portuguese captain ended at this point. So Drake gave his crew a rousing speech. His crew loved him, apart from his second in command, and renamed his ship the Golden Hind and went into the Strait of Magellan, which was quite difficult and challenging because the wind was nearly always against you and the current was always against you. But anyway, Drake made it through the Straits in 16 days in August 1578, which at the time was a record. Now, his good luck didn't last. This lovely map came out of a book I found that was published in about 1950, I think, and it shows Drake's supposed route on emerging from the Magellan Strait. He was blown southeast for 52 days by a storm. He lost 1 ship and then sailed north again, and another storm drove him out to sea again. So it just brought home to everyone the challenges of this area. And in October 1578, we know that he found shelter at an island somewhere along the south there that he called Elizabetha. Now, if you do some sums and calculations, and you know about navigation, and today you know about currents, and particularly the Cape Horn current, you will know that there was a tendency to estimate incorrectly where you were. And those dotted lines on that map are this author's suggestion for where Drake might have been. In other words, far further east than he thought. That leads me on quite neatly to an article I copied on the Times, which I've kept ever since, in 1997. And it was just shortly after I'd been approached by some members of the Drake Society who had reckoned they had proven that the island Drake actually landed on was Cape Horn, and that therefore the Dutchman, Willem Schouten, whose ship, the Horn, it is now named for, and who was only there in 1616, so quite a lot later, shouldn't perhaps have taken all the credit. This was via a lovely newsreader, Sandy Gall, who a lot of you will remember. He got involved in this project, and actually we were going to go down there, and according to Fletcher, the fleet captain, an inscription had been carved into a stone on the island that Drake landed on. And the idea was to try and find it. Well, needless to say, it has never been found. And I guess this story will only ever be proven or disproven if it is. But one of the key things was that in Fletcher's log, he does say, from their island, no land could be seen to the south. And that is only true of very few islands on the southern edge of Tierra del Fuego, including Cape Horn itself. So there was a little side note. And this map, I think, is interesting because it was made after Drake had got home. So it used a lot of the information that he provided, and everyone was very aware of the need for accurate surveying. But it clearly shows the Straits of Magellan as a channel with a few islands dotted to the south. And interestingly, it's probably too small for you to read, but it says Queen's Island to the south there. So that was interesting to me. Now, just to finish Drake's story, because it was an exciting one, he did do plenty of ransacking of the Spanish coast. He sailed north. He was badly wounded at La Mocha, the island top left there, which is off Chile. He sacked Valparaiso. He captured a ship full of wine. So Chile was obviously producing good wine even then. He captured a Spanish treasure ship near Lima that had the equivalent of £7 million worth of gold on board. And then his biggest prize was one of the Spanish galleons, which were trading between Acapulco and Manila, which had 13 chests of gold plate and 26 tons of silver on board. He didn't stop there. He looked for a northwest passage, predating a lot of other expeditions. He claimed California for the Queen. He crossed the Pacific, he crossed the Indian Ocean, and came home with considerable prizes. The Queen took a 50% share of the prize, which that year was more than the normal annual royal income. As a result, no doubt, Drake was knighted by the Queen. And the other significant and nice thing about Drake is he brought his entire crew home. Very unusual in those days. I'm going to briefly talk about another voyage. This is called the Armada of the Strait, and this is a Spanish one. This was absolutely and immediately inspired by Drake, because the Spanish were terrified that these English and other French interlopers would go and interrupt their trade routes. So they decided to send an armada down to the bottom of South America to sort this out. The map on the left there shows, quite interestingly enough, the Strait of Magellan as like a cut through a continent. And this is because there was a school of thought at the time that thought that Tierra del Fuego might be a continent and that there was no way around it apart from going through the Strait of Magellan. So obviously that made it a key point that needed protecting. Philip I of Portugal, who was also Philip II of Spain at the time, unusually, sent his armada to fortify and settle the Strait of Magellan and prevent further incursions into the Pacific was the main reason. And the idea for the settlement came from a chap called Pedro Sarmiento, who'd been through the Straits, thought it could be settled, and he came and lobbied the king. The king then appointed Diego Flores, who was an experienced naval man, to actually run the fleet. Sarmiento was very jealous of that. They didn't get on at all. So you can feel a sort of disaster building already. In 1581, 23 ships set sail with 3,500 men aboard, between crew and soldiers. Of those 23 ships and 3,500, only 5 ships and 600 men eventually returned. The fleet actually spent most of its time off the coast of Brazil. They had multiple attempts to try and sail down to the Magellan Straits, and only on the third one did they succeed. And Flores had split the fleet at this stage, so that was Sarmiento on his own. One reason I think Flores not got cold feet, but lost his enthusiasm, was he was by now convinced that there was no southern continent of Tierra del Fuego. So he could see that the points of fortifying the strait was less relevant. Anyway, Sarmiento established his colony in 1584. 338 colonists were settled on the north shore of the Magellan Straits. at a site then called Rey Don Felipe, after the king, but became known as Port Famine, because that is sadly exactly what happened. It's now part of Chile, that area. There's a photograph of the site, top right, where you can see there's very little remains of any settlement showing. The two forts that were meant to be built were never built. And sadly, when British sailor Thomas Cavendish passed in 1587, so 3 years later, there was no sign of life. So as far as we know, only 2 colonists survived. They were both picked up by passing ships. And Flores had a postscript too. He went back to Spain. It was nearly time for the Spanish Armada. And because the ducal leader of the Armada was inexperienced, Flores was put in as his advisor. Well, of course, when the Armada was a complete flop, there was only one person to blame. So poor old Flores spent a lot of time in prison. Now, moving forward, George Anson, another fleet. This was also a disastrous voyage in many ways, but I think is quite a good example of how to wrestle a bit of victory, at least, from disaster. Now, Anson's story is connected to the South Sea bubble, which we've all heard of. The South Sea was the name for the Southern Pacific, and really the great unknown. The South Sea Company was formed in 1711. The bubble actually happened in 1720, so before all the events here. But it all arose from the fact that the Spanish Empire, they only allowed one foreign merchant ship a year to trade in their empire. So there was always great enthusiasm in England for any scheme that could get at the Spanish and attack their possessions in some way. So in just before 1740, the Duke of Newcastle gave Anson the orders to follow the route that you see in front of you there, go to South America and hassle the Spanish a bit and find routes. They also carried some trade goods with them, and the whole trip was probably proposed by 2 South Sea Company factors originally. There was always a bit of doom hanging over it. The Spanish, through their spies, heard about this fleet and sent a squadron of 5 ships to stop them under Admiral Jose Pizarro. Luckily for Anson, Pizarro's luck seems to have been even worse, and most of them, I think, sank. They never met him anyway. So Anson's main challenge was finding the people he needed, and they became so desperate that they raided not only press-ganged crew, but they raided the local hospitals for invalided seamen and soldiers. And in the end, Anson left in 1740, left the shores here with just under 2,000 seamen and soldiers in 6 warships, plus 2 supply ships. The Centurion, his flagship, was the only one of the 6 to complete the circumnavigation. And when it arrived home 4 years later, only 188 of the original members of the crew were on board. So in other words, 1,400 men had died, mainly from scurvy, it must be said, but also initially because they were just too invalid to travel, and later some from starvation. On the first leg of the voyage to Madeira, 7 weeks, 14 died. On the next leg, 7 weeks, to Santa Catarina Island, where Florianopolis is today in Brazil, 160 died and 450 fell sick. So, and that was all before scurvy hit, for which the only remedy they had was a rather violent purgative. Anyway, they headed south from Santa Catarina into storms immediately. Ships lost their masts, and eventually they regrouped, funnily enough, at Puerto San Julian. which Anson didn't think much of at all. There are these rather nice engravings of his little fleet there. He found it a desolate spot with no fresh water, or not water fit to drink anyway. Anyway, here's another map which looks suspiciously like Drake's, doesn't it? If you look at the spider of his route there, Anson didn't even go through the Straits of Magellan. He went straight for the Horn and sailed round the tip, and then got blown about. And he also totally underestimated the Cape Horn current, which meant he was 300 miles further east than he thought he was when he got across. And basically you tacked your way across, and when you thought you were clear of the South American coast, you started to head north. Well, Anson headed north, and only by the eagle-eyed eye of one of his lookouts did they avoid slamming into the cliffs of the southern fjords near Noir Island. So that was a disaster. 2 of the ships didn't even make it round. They had, by good forethought, arranged rendezvous points, because I think they thought it was fairly certain they would get separated. There was one called Socorro Island on the southern coast of Chile. Another one was Valdivia, a little bit further up. And the main rendezvous point was Juan Fernandez Island, which you can see just top left there in that picture. So Anson went to Juan Fernandez Island and waited to see how much of the rest of his fleet would arrive. And some did. The Gloucester arrived, one called the Trial arrived, and finally a little boat called Anna arrived. She'd been blown ashore in Chile, and the bay where she landed is still called Bahia Pink today. She was lucky because they'd had some time, her crew had had time on shore, had eaten some vegetables, and so they were much less sick than the rest of them. And then I rather like these engravings of Juan Fernandez Island. Incredibly accurate, actually. If you just look at the outline of that mountain in the top right, thought I'd just show you a couple of pictures of modern day Juan Fernandez. And I think you can quite clearly see that the mountain is there and was pretty accurately portrayed in that picture. It's a lovely island. It's really hard to get to. There are no regular flights. The airport is the far end of the island from any settlement. So you have one way, you either go by boat or walking on a trail. But it's got a lovely little bay, slightly prone to tsunamis. But I think one of our clients, I'm not sure if Charlie Sanson's on this call, but he's the only person I know who we sent there and had a lovely time. Now, there are a little side story. I'm not going to go into this in any great detail, but 2 of Anson's ships sloped back to England. There was some evidence that logs had been updated to make their position seem more perilous than it actually was. Though, when they arrived in Rio, their fresh water had run out and their crew didn't even have the strength to furl their sails. So I think they did have quite a hard time. The most scandalous story at the time was the Voyager. And the picture on the left here shows the Voyager, which was wrecked on the coast of Chile, 600 miles south of Valdivia in 1741. And there was a mutiny. The captain, I don't think, was of Drake's quality. He shot one of the crewmen, but that didn't make any difference. And so the mutineers headed south and worked their way eventually back to England, some of them, not even most of them. Whereas the captain, Captain Cheap, he was called, together with a crewman called Byron, who was the poet's grandfather, in fact, and went on voyages of his own, which I won't be talking about. They made it back by going north with some native help, and then overland to Buenos Aires and back. But there was an incredible loss of life. 40 died while they were all deciding what to do. And the last survivors arrived back in England in 1746. Now, Anson still hadn't done anything constructed at this stage to harry the Spanish. So he continued north with the ships he had. Some were broken up to provide spares for the ships he had. And in fact, the Centurion was the only one that eventually made it back to England and did the circumnavigation. He looted this poor little town of Paita, which today is in Peru. So that was his little bit of Spanish interfering, and is another story. He then crossed the Pacific. He had heard that there was a Spanish galleon due to sail, and he managed to wait for it, and in the end, after several missed attempts, he managed to catch up with it when it was near Manila. And this painting was painted, I guess, at the time, showing that the tiny Centurion bravely attacking the large Spanish galleon, which was called the Covadonga. In fact, it's a total misrepresentation, we now know, because both ships were very similar in size. And of course, the Centurion had far more guns than the galleon. So it was a mismatched fight, but it was a very successful day for Anson, because she had an incredible treasure on board. When Anson returned to England, Spithead, he had a treasure worth £400,000 on board in the money of the day, including 1.3 million pieces of eight, which was sent to the Tower of London, which is what you see happening here, in 32 wagons. I think they reckon it would have been worth just under £100 million today. It was the biggest prize ever landed in England on a single ship, and Anson was entitled to a 3/8 share. Even a seaman received the equivalent of 20 years' pay. So I suppose, being a sailor in those days, you're either pressed, and occasionally you did get very lucky. Anson, the rest of he did very well after that, as you can imagine. He was made Rear Admiral of the Blue and ended up as Admiral of the Fleet, and had a successful naval career after that. So those were a few little voyages, and now I'm going to zoom in more on Tierra del Fuego for the last two. But before I do, I thought I would just give a quick summary, for those of you who don't know, of the native peoples who were on Tierra del Fuego when all these voyages were going past. And they can be divided into, on Tierra del Fuego itself, into three main tribes. First of all, in the south were the Yámana, or Yágan people, as Bridges called them, and they were canoe people, as were what we now call the Kaweskar, or Alcalufes, a little bit further to the west. They were also oceanside dwelling people, and they fished. They used spears to fish, they used nets to fish, lived from seals, fish, otters, that sort of thing. They were quite short. They were incredibly hardy. The bottom picture is an old picture of the Yágan, group of Yágan people. The top picture is a group of Alcalufes. And then the other tribe on the island were the Ona, also known as the Selknam, who were inland. They hunted guanaco with bows and arrows. So they had a completely different way of life and lifestyle. They were much taller. They weren't probably the very tall Patagonians that gave Patagonia its name. Those would have been more likely to be Tehuelches from the mainland further north. So the Selknam, they survived from eating guanaco and foxes mainly. All of these people got their tinder stone, fire stone, from one site, only found in one site on the whole, on one of the peninsulas. So they kept, the canoe people certainly kept their fires alight. And it is this, as you probably know, that gave Tierra del Fuego its name, because they were carting fire around with them. Not that they couldn't make it, but it was just easier to do that. And they also used smoke as a signal. So there you are, a very, very speedy history of the peoples of Tierra del Fuego before people like Fitzroy came along. I've spoken about Fitzroy before, so I'm only going to skim over what happened, what he did. But the first voyage of the Beagle was started off with Pringle Stokes as captain, who at Port Famine actually got so low that he shot himself, and that was when Fitzroy was eventually given command of the Beagle, and they found the Beagle Channel, named after the ship, obviously. Also on this voyage was they managed to lose a boat. A seaman called Murray lost a boat. The story is a bit vague, in some narrows, which are today called the Murray Narrows. And Fitzroy seems to have initially taken 4 Fuegian natives as hostages, though I think they came quite willingly in the end. And you've probably heard the names. They were, the sailors named them. There was one girl, Fuegia Basket, who was quite young. There was an older Alcaluf Indian called York Minster. And York Minster was a rock that I think Captain Cook had named because it looked a bit like York Minster. There was a rascal called Jemmy Button. You need a few characters. And the fourth one was called Boat Memory, I guess, to remind them of the boat. And Fitzroy took all of them back to England to quote him, to civilize them and teach them the plainer truths of Christianity. Well, most of their time between leaving in Tierra del Fuego and when he brought them back on the second voyage was actually spent on board ship with Fitzroy and then Darwin. But in their time in England, they did have some schooling. They did learn a bit of English, a few customs, clothes, things they hadn't been used to. And they even met the king during their time. So on the second voyage, when Fitzroy came back, this time accompanied by the young Charles Darwin, they actually had a lot of time with these Fuegians on the Beagle, on the Atlantic crossing, to get to know them. And Fitzroy was fascinated by their language and wanted to try and make a bit of a dictionary. It was really difficult because they are fantastic mimics. So anything they said to them was just echoed back without any sense of meaning, I think. And the few words that Fitzroy did write down and think he got the meaning of, it probably wasn't quite right. There were probably subtleties that weren't there. Darwin was very rude about the people, you can see there, scarcely deserved to be called articulate. He thought they had a tiny vocabulary. Well, as we later found out from Thomas Bridges, who compiled the first ever Yágan English dictionary, it had 32,000 words in it, so they were certainly not inarticulate. And they also seem to have, and again, this is a Bridges theory, Fitzroy and Darwin were convinced they were slightly cannibalistic and that they ate their old women. Bridges thinks this is a nice story and a willingness to please on behalf of the Fuegians. And they sort of told it to them as a bit of a joke. They devour their old women before they kill their dogs. Well, that was apparently because the dogs at least can catch otters. So that was Fitzroy. The one thing I haven't mentioned, they did try to establish a Christian settlement on Woolaya Bay on Tierra del Fuego. Fitzroy left a young chap called Richard Matthews there. He left him not for very long. I think it was a matter of days, and luckily they came back to see how he was getting on, by which time the locals had stolen all his clothes, and he wasn't at all happy. So he was taken off again. So that was the first abortive attempt at a settlement. And now my final character is Thomas Bridges. I'm not going to go through the story of Bridges' son, Lucas Bridges, The Uttermost Parts of the Earth, because it is such a wonderful book that if you haven't, you need to read it yourselves. But Bridges Senior, I think, has an absolutely wonderful story. So I just thought I'd summarize that for you. In about 1845, a young orphan was found wandering on a bridge in Bristol, and he had the letter T embroidered on his clothes. So when he was taken into the orphanage, I imagine, they called him Thomas for T, and they called him Bridges. So, and then he was adopted by the Reverend George Despard. So that was the beginning of Thomas Bridges' story. And who could have imagined where it would end up? Despard was the secretary of the Patagonian Missionary Society, whose founder, called Alan Gardiner, had retired from the Navy and dedicated his life to preaching to the heathen. They made an abortive attempt to TIERRA FUEGO in 1848, where they had to return. They just weren't organized then. And in 1850, they tried again, Gardiner this was, to land on TIERRA FUEGO and establish a community. It was tragic. Gardiner went with 6 companions and they all died. His basic problem was he forgot the ammunition. So they couldn't eat, they didn't know how to survive like a local. They starved. They tried to contact Jemmy Button, who was still around, and they thought quite reasonably that if he could speak English, then he might be a way in to train the natives in their religion. But Alan Gardiner, in his last sort of log that he left by his body, suggested that the best way to establish a mission would be actually to establish it on the Falkland Islands, which you can see top right there in that picture, and then which were uninhabited at that time, had no native population. And that would be a much safer way of setting up a mission. So George Despard, Thomas Bridges' adopted father, carried out Gardiner's wishes, and he sent a schooner, called appropriately enough the Alan Gardiner, to the Falklands to start a mission. A year later, the people from the mission sailed to TIERRA FUEGO, found Jemmy Button, asked him whether he'd go back to the Falklands with them. He refused, but some other natives did go. So the process had started. And finally, in 1856, Despard himself, I think he saw this project needed a bit of organization. He was obviously an organizer. He himself left for Keppel Island on the Falklands with his family. And of course, his family included young Thomas Bridges, then 13. Bridges picked up the Yágan language, young, bright, picked up the language very quickly, faster than anyone else. And that, I think, was the key moment, really, in Bridges' life. There was one more attempt to establish a mission on TIERRA FUEGO, one more, I should say, abortive attempt. When a party was landed, it didn't include Bridges, luckily for him. Everyone was killed except the cook, who happened to have stayed on board the ship, probably egged on by Jemmy Button, who sounds as though he was an awkward character, jealous that anyone else should have the privilege that he'd been given by Fitzroy. And so that was another abortive attempt. And then Despard returned to England, but he offered young Bridges the chance to stay as interim superintendent of the mission, which Bridges eagerly accepted, aged only 18. And that was when he began his dictionary. So that was the development of the missionary society and the sort of roots of it, if you like. They were looking for a place to build a mission in Tierra del Fuego. They chose Ushuaia in the end as the site for the first non-native settlement because it had a good harbour, it was central in the Beagle Channel, and there was space for allotments, a bit of agriculture. And and a little prefab was made, ready to be shipped over. Bridges had been going backwards and forwards by boat, but no one had stayed. Anyway, when the idea of Bridges being in charge of this settlement was brought up, the powers that be decided that if that was going to happen, he had to be ordained. So he was sent back to England, where he was ordained. And also, happily for him, managed to find a wife in about 5 days, I think. So actually, the first white settler to live on Tierra del Fuego was the Reverend Waite Stirling, who lived there from 1869. He eventually became the Bishop of the Falklands, Stirling did, and which was to become the largest diocese in the world because it included all of South America. The Bridges family, then just Thomas and his wife, Mary, came back to the Falklands where they spent 22 months. Their eldest daughter, Mary, on the right in that picture on the left, was born in the Falklands. They got married, by the way, 5 weeks after meeting in Bristol, where Bridges was lecturing. He must have been a very good lecturer. And after their 22 months in the Falklands, he took his new wife to her new house at Ushuaia. Poor Mary had to walk up the shore past native wigwams to her unfinished, shared bungalow that had been prefabricated and plonked, called rather grandly Stirling House. But she must have been an exceptional person because not only did she thrive, but everyone loved her. Their family grew. That picture, actually, there's one missing. One was born after that. Alice was born later. Lucas Bridges is just in front of his father. On the left is the eldest son, Despard, who was the first white person to be born on Tierra del Fuego. There was another family living there. They had number 2, and Lucas Bridges in the middle there, with a rather cheeky grin, was the third white person to be born on Tierra del Fuego on the 31st of December, 1874. They were really, they had no problems with the natives at all. You've got to read the book for the whole story of the family, of course. But they must have been really extraordinary people. And because of Thomas's ability to communicate with the natives, of course, they achieved incredible things. In 1884, the Argentine government, who hadn't even set foot, I don't think, on Tierra del Fuego, finally woke up and formally sent a little fleet to Ushuaia to take possession. Bridges welcomed them, and the Argentine flag was raised, the mission flag came down, there was a 21-gun salute, apparently. Everything was very friendly, and the independence of the mission was guaranteed. Any assistance required was offered. The Argentine government very sensibly appointed a sub-prefect who spoke English, because at that point, even though Bridges had taught some Spanish to his children, really there was no Spanish spoken in Tierra del Fuego at all. The sad thing about that visit was that it brought the first epidemic of measles. It was very serious. The local tribes people had no immunity, and a lot of them died. And sadly, it wasn't the first time nor the last time that that happened. Anyway, Bridges felt he'd achieved his aims in Ushuaia. Law and order prevailed. Cattle and horses had arrived. What he wanted for the local people was somewhere where employment would be guaranteed. And he had found a patch of land where he thought that could work. Now, at the time, the Argentine government would only grant land to an individual, so it wouldn't give land to the mission. So Bridges resigned from the mission, went to Buenos Aires, met the president, Roca, who seems to have been very progressive, and they got on very well, who granted him 8 square leagues of land, which is today's HARBERTON, Estancia HARBERTON, where the family set up a very successful sort of corporate effort, farm enterprise, very hard, but they managed it and continued his dreams. And Thomas died in 1898. He'd been unwell for some years, aged 56 in Buenos Aires. He'd suffered ill health, as I say, but he said, "I live in my children." And his family certainly carried that on. And before I move on from this slide, I just wanted to thank Ian and Dilys Hemming, who are in the audience here, for those 2 lovely photos on the right. The modern day HARBERTON, they were there maybe 10 years ago. Ian, I can't remember. Put a note in the chat, please do, which I can't see at the moment. And I love the wigwam at the bottom, because this was a recreation of the descendants of Lucas Bridges, I understand, of making a wigwam and seeing how long it would last. I just thought I'd show you a few pictures of the Ona people, because Lucas Bridges was involved in making a road through to the north, through the coastal range, where the family founded another estancia called VIAMONTE. And this is firmly in Ona territory, which Lucas himself, I think, was a great admirer of the Ona. Maybe it was because he was a tall person. Anyway, he loved them. He learned their language, and I think it's true to say that the Bridges family, all of them, did their best to protect and preserve the native peoples and their way of life and their languages. And of course, it is sad, but there were, when Lucas Bridges was born, there were 9,000, more or less, native people on Tierra del Fuego. And when he wrote his book in 1947, he tells us that there were only 150 left. There was one very shameful period of genocide with the Selknam people, called the Selknam genocide, where they were simply gunned down. But I'm afraid the main killer was measles. And in the last 3 waves were in the 20s. And today, I'm not sure there are any native speakers left in Tierra del Fuego. Anyway, I don't want to end on a completely negative note. It's a sad but uplifting story. Do read the book, because it's absolutely fantastic. And Lucas Bridges was badgered to write The Uttermost Part of the Earth by none other than A.F. Schifferly, who some of you may know wrote a book called Schifferly's Ride. He rode his horses from Buenos Aires to New York. And I thought I'd just finish up by showing you a few pretty pictures of Tierra del Fuego today. That's another shot of HARBERTON. This is the Pia Glacier in the southern fjords of Tierra del Fuego on a beautiful sunny day. And this is Wulaya Bay, where Jemmy Button was from. And this is really just to show you about the only way some of you might have been on one of the Australis boats, which is the boat you can see in that picture. It's a Chilean company, a very good company. They do 3 or 4 day trips through the fjords on the routes you can see on the right there between Ushuaia and Punta Arenas. And visit Cape Horn as well. So you can have a look for Drake's carving. And I thought I'd finish with a reading list, as usual. Just 3 little books that I found useful. Anson's trip is very nicely described in Glyn Williams' book called The Prize of All the Oceans. That's a nice read, much recent material. Anson himself wrote a very popular book immediately after he got back. How do you turn disaster into a victory? You write about it. The other book, the middle book, I know many of you have read because I've recommended it many times, Harry Thompson's book, This Thing of Darkness, all about Fitzroy. And finally, Lucas Bridges' book, which, as I say, is sadly out of print, but well worth trying to get a copy if you haven't read it. That's it. So thank you very much.